tonight I want to move us out of Italy and into Poland and into Prague. So I want to pick up at roughly the same time period where we left off. You know, this Sforno died in 1550 or thereabouts, and I want to pick up in 1550 with the birth of the author of the commentary of the Kli Yakar, a man called Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz. Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz. Okay? And I want to talk about the 16th and 17th century, as I mentioned, in Poland, and so just to orient you as to where we are, I'm going to pull up a map. Everyone should have a source sheet. I've also put a copy of the source sheet in the chat. But if I can, hopefully I can. Well, it's not working right this second, but hopefully you have on the source sheet a map of this region. And if you're able to see it, now I think I've almost got it. If you're able to see it, what you should notice is that right in the middle of the map, which is on page 1 of your source sheets, is where this journey begins in the city of Lunchitz. Lunchitz is located basically halfway between Poznan and Warsaw. I'm going to make one more attempt to put this up. Okay, hopefully you can see this now. So you have Lunchitz, spelled in the Polish, between Poznan and Warsaw. That's where Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz is born. As we'll come back to his biography in a second, but he's educated in Lublin, which at the time is a prominent, Polish city. He becomes a rabbi in Lvov, which is also known as Lemberg, which is in present day Ukraine, sort of in this vicinity of Galicia, where Herschel would be around here. Raisha is here for those of you familiar with the intricacies of Galician geography. And then the last 20 or so years of his rabbinic career, he spends in Prague, way over in the western part of this map. Okay, so why do we care about Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz, and what is the significance of his commentary? Okay, so just to put things in context, in the second half of the 16th century, this is a kind of golden age for Polish Jewry and for the Jews of Prague. There's a tremendous amount of autonomy and self-rule. You may have heard of the Council of Four Lands, which was maybe sui generis in Jewish history for almost 200 years. There was just this extraordinary amount of autonomy and economic autonomy in the Jewish community. Jews were allowed to collect their own taxes, legislate their own rules and regulations for how to live communally. And you have the four lands are, sometimes it's 3 lands, sometimes 5 lands. The 4 lands are Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, Galicia, and Volhynia. As I mentioned, economically and structurally, this is a good time for the Jews of the region. Some very contemporary historians have noted that one of the important features of this time in Jewish history in these lands is that in many Jewish communities, this is almost the exact opposite of what we saw last week in Italy. In many of these communities, Jews are actually the majority. So, you talk about the Jews in Ferrara, so there's 28 Jews and they're living in this Catholic country. So you could be living in this city of Lublin in the middle of Poland, and there might be 60% of the city might be Jewish, and that's a very different experience. That's a very different experience than it is to be the massive underdog in a particular community. So as a child or as a young person, little Ephraim was sent to Lublin, which was a much bigger Jewish community than Lunchitz, and he studied under the Maharshal, Reb Shlomo Luria. Reb Shlomo Luria was one of the greatest halachic authorities ever one of the greatest halachic authorities of the 16th century for sure. Maybe second only, maybe not even second to the Rama in 16th century Poland, is the author of the Chachma Shlomo, the Yamshel Shlomo. Just a towering rabbinic figure, and one of his students late in life is Ephraim Lunchitz. We don't know that much about his biography, but we do know from his writings that he was clearly proficient in Jewish philosophy and general philosophy as well. Now, unlike a lot of the other figures that we've seen, one of the distinguishing features of Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz is that he, for the first half of his career at least, was not a professional rabbi. He was rather a maggid. Okay, and this is important to know from a Jewish history perspective. You know, the rabbinate was divided, which is to say, you might have a professional rabbi who was the rabbi in your shul, and you asked him your shilas, and maybe he taught classes, and he was responsible for being Mesader Kiddushin or arranging for a get if someone was getting divorced. But he wasn't a public orator. He would speak on Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol, and maybe one or two other times a year. But week in, week out, if you wanted to hear a good drasha, there was a professional darshan, there was a professional maggid. Sometimes it was someone who was itinerant, who traveled around, like a scholar in residence kind of person. And sometimes it was a functionary hired by the community, who was literally a scholar in residence. The maggid lived in town, and that was his job to be a darshan. And this was the career. This was the profession of Rabbi Ephraim. This was the career of the author of the Kli Yakar. There's a quote I'll just read to you, which is going to be very important for understanding who this man was. From a scholar who lived, a couple centuries ago. He wrote this article about the Kli Yakar in 1931, a man called Israel Batan. He was a teacher of homiletics at HUC. And you have this on your source sheet. He writes the following. He says, in this sense, Ephraim Lunchitz may be regarded as a preacher of true originality, who did not cook the scraps from others' fare, who to rise to the source employed no other assistance than what his inherited ideals and his own powers of interpretation afforded, whose own heart, as Goethe would have it, was eloquent, to be sure. He did not originate any startling truth, great popular preachers who rise from the people and speak to the heart of the people in the language understood by the people, aim at a far less magnificent but even more precious query. These are the natural poets of the people, dreaming dreams and seeing visions such as the people could well claim as their very own, even though they may not always be conscious of their import and worth. And this is the point I want to focus on. In fact, to renew and strengthen that consciousness in the people, to purify and ennoble their impulses, to enlighten their minds and refine their spirits, to gather up the ordinary materials of life and make them glorious by the profounder interpretation put upon them, this is, after all, the chief task of the earnest preacher. Okay? And this was the task set to by the Kli Yakar, an itinerant preacher and a professional preacher. Okay, and this is going to be very important when we talk about his identity and his commentary in a minute. Okay, I should have mentioned at the beginning, so let me just pause and say it because I'm remembering it now. But I want to thank Avi Schreiber for sponsoring tonight's class, which is sponsored to commemorate the yahrzeit of his mother, Evelyn Schreiber, Chava Bas Chanoch Henoch HaKohen. May her neshama have an aliyah, and of course the learning that we do tonight is Le'ilui Nishmas. So the status of the Kli Yakar of Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz was fairly precarious at various points in his life. He writes in he authored 5 or 6 important books, one of which is the Kli Yakar, which is our subject for tonight. But in another book called Olalos Ephraim, which is probably his magnum opus, he reflects on the first book that he wrote in his youth. And you have this in source number 2. And it's fascinating just to note something that he says almost in passing. I'll just read it. I'm not going to put it on the screen. If you have it, it's great. Otherwise, you'll just listen. It's self-explanatory. He says, Shibimei Chorfi, Chibarti Sefer Musar Nikra Ir Giburim. When I was a kid, when I was younger, I wrote a book of Musar. It was called Ir Giburim. Biyan biyan shebizman shechibarti achibur ahu lo haya biyadi lo lachem v'lo simla. And at the time, I had nothing. I was flat broke. I was living in a city called Yaroslav. In my house, I had no books. In the city, there were no books. He says, I have to confess. I cited a lot of sources. I made a lot of quotations, and I got a lot of things wrong. But lo iskarti shema can't make the word. הזכרתי שם המכתב או המדרש, כי לא ידעתי מקומו, ולא כתבתי רק מה ששמר כוח הזוכר, ממה שקריתי בבכורתי. He said, I was just doing it all from memory. So, forgive me if I made errors. I had no library. Okay, and it's just a stunning thing to think. There's no comment like this in Rashi. There's no comment like this in the Barbanel. Meaning they may have had challenges, but they had the resources that they had, and there wasn't a time where where they would say like, oh, I just had to do it all from memory because I didn't have books at my disposal. Amazing to think, based on circumstance and poverty, in the age of the printing press, right? In the age of the printing press, that a prominent Rav could be in a situation where they're without a library, without just the normal books that would be expected to be in any Jewish home. Okay, so he goes on to say, I didn't have money to print my books, but the Council of the Four Lands, which he actually calls the Council of the Three Lands at this point, helped sponsor me because they were so impressed and so happy to support me that they, probably the only time in history, the Council of Four Lands, they underwrote some of the publishing costs of the Kli Yakar's work. Okay, in 1601, he also writes about this in the introduction to one of his books. He says, 1601, I got very sick. I became deathly ill. I thought I was going to die, and I added a name. There's a very old Jewish custom. Someone is sick, so you add a name. So his birth name was Ephraim Lunchitz, and he added the name Shlomo. So sometimes you'll see that he's not called Ephraim, but you'll see both names, Shlomo and Ephraim. That happened as a result of this near-death experience. Okay, he survived this illness, 1601, and the next year, 1602, he published the work that we're going to talk about in a minute, the Kli Yakar. In its own time, the Kli Yakar became very well known, very popular as a commentary to the Chumash. And 2 years later, he was appointed a Rosh Yeshiva in Prague. Okay, so he gets this new position, and he moves. As I mentioned, you saw the map all the way west to Prague. I just happened to find online a picture of the Prague Castle, an illustration of the Prague Castle from 1606. So this is exactly the time. That the Kli Yakar would have been in Prague. I'm sure most of you have been there and visited the Jewish community and the museums and Kafka's neighborhood, right? So Prague, right, is all there, right? It's really extraordinary. I should just mention in passing, by the way, if you're trying to contextualize, when we are in general history. So it just so happens that the Kli Yakar's dates are almost exactly contemporaneous with Shakespeare. Somebody says Kli Yakar, and you want to try to just remember in your head when he lived, almost exactly. Kli Yakar is born in 1550, Shakespeare's 1554. Shakespeare dies in 1616, I think, and the Kli Yakar dies in 1619. They didn't meet each other, right? Scholars wonder if Shakespeare ever met a Jew. Right? In the time that Shakespeare was writing, Jews weren't permitted to be living in England. But just to give you a sense of this time, I included the illustration of the Prague Castle. Just share with you in source number 3, the Kli Yakar writes something fascinating. And if anybody wants a homework assignment, maybe you can crack a code that I've not been able to crack. Okay, he's in Prague, 1606. And in 1606, the fall of 1606, he says the following happened. The source number 3. He says, "Vayihi ba'itim halalu, b'chodesh Tishrei shin samach zayin." If you ever want a trick for converting Hebrew dates into Gregorian dates, So just add 240. Okay. So Shin Samach Zayin is 367, add 240, and you get 1607. It only works if you're not talking about like the very end of the Gregorian year. Tishrei is still the previous year. So you could adjust it a little, but basically add 240 and you're good to go. So this is the very end of 1606. He says, what happened? Something happened which was for my benefit, but not for my good. Ki hotzi Hashem kli za'amo ala umos. Shalach behem es hadavar mishlachas malachei ra'im. Ad asher me'emas maves baruchu rabim mim hamakom hanal. Something happened. God released his wrath on the city of Prague, and everybody started to flee. They were nervous that they were going to die. So everyone fled, and he goes on to say, I fled, so I was like on a break because my community was in, not in Prague. So he says I had time to work on my book, but at the end of the day, we weren't happy about this. I've not been able to figure out. I didn't find evidence of, happens to be in 1606, there was a plague in London, but I didn't find any evidence of a plague in Prague. I didn't find evidence of a fire or an earthquake. So if anybody knows what this is a reference to, I'm curious. But of course, it doesn't matter. There's nothing writing on it. Just a point of interest that even in Prague, which is a wonderful place to be a Jew in 1606, there's still disasters or natural disasters or other issues that arise. And the Kli Yakar is, fleeing with the rest of his city's residents. Who was the rabbi? Who was the chief rabbi in Prague? Right at this time, I mentioned that he was appointed to be the Prague's Rosh Yeshiva in 1604, but he wasn't appointed to be the chief rabbi of Prague. That job belonged to the most famous Jew to ever live in Prague, the Maharal. Okay, the Maharal of Prague. Was the preeminent figure of his day, and he was the chief rabbi until his death in 1609. When he dies, Rabbi Ephraim is appointed his successor. Okay, so who do you have to be the Maharal's successor? Obviously, that in itself should tell us something about the esteem in which he was held. He succeeded the Maharal. His grave is still there. You can go to the old cemetery. I'm sure many of you have been there and seen it. I just put it on the source sheet. Here you have it on page 3, standing ad hayom hazeh, 400 and some odd years after his death. Oh, I guess last year was the 400th yahrzeit of the Kli Yakar. So you could still see his grave in the Jewish cemetery. He lives out the rest of his career as the chief rabbi of Prague. So the Kli Yakar's Perush is printed in his lifetime, and it's reprinted many, many times. It's printed prominently in the Mikros Gedolos, right, which is an anthology of great Jewish commentaries. You have Rashi and Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam and the Ramban and the Kli Yakar. Right? So somebody made a decision very early on that his commentary warranted inclusion in the great anthology of Chumash commentaries, and it's remained so. Ad hayom hazeh, he remains very, very popular. So let me just share with you in source number 4. In his introduction, the Kli Yakar writes something about why he wrote this book, and I'll just summarize for you a couple of the highlights in the interest of time. The Kli Yakar says, I wrote this book to preach, right? To give tochacha, to give musar, to moralize and give people moral direction in their lives. And this is a very different strategy or very different agenda than many of the other commentaries that we've seen up until this point, and we'll see how that manifests itself in just a couple minutes when we look at some of the excerpts in his commentary. So let me just share a couple of defining characteristics of his commentary, and then we'll see the Kli Yakar a little bit, at least, in action. So the Kli Yakar is interested in pshat, or so he says, but he also welcomes medrash and he also welcomes Kabbalah. I think probably the most important thing I can say about his commentary, much less is written about the Kli Yakar than anyone else will see over the course of this semester. So maybe I'm going out on a limb a little, but what I want to argue is that because the Kli Yakar was by interest, by disposition, and by profession, a preacher and a Magid, he was interested basically in capturing the attention of his audience. And how does a preacher capture the attention of his audience? So he uses tricks, right? And just think about the difference between a great public speaker on the one hand and a philosopher on the other. So the philosopher may have the deeper idea, and it may be more profound, it may be more compelling, but who's it easier to listen to, right? The really professional, polished orator, because the professional, polished orator is going to make a joke, and he's going to tell a story, and he's going to tell a parable, and he's going to weave in secular culture with Jewish sources. He's going to make compelling cases and keep his audience interested, and that is one of the great strengths of the Kli Yakar. And as a result, in his written word, which is not so different in orientation from his spoken word, some of his other books are his sermons written down. The Kli Yakar is not a book of sermons; it's a book of biblical commentary, but it shares from the same playbook. So in that playbook, you're going to get, as I mentioned, a story and a parable and a medrash and a gematria and an acronym and a Roshei Tevos. Okay, I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. Here's one from Parsha Shoftim. It's actually not on your source sheet. The Torah says in Parsha Shoftim about the king. You're going to appoint a king. V'haya keshivto al kisei mamlachto v'chasav lo es mishneh Torah zos al sefer l'pnei hakohanim modim. So he's going to sit on his throne and he's going to write a sefer Torah. The king has a special mitzvah to write a sefer Torah. So that's all fine and good. V'haya keshivto al kisei mamlachto. What does that mean? He's going to sit on his throne? What's the relevance of that pasuk? So the Kli Yakar has a great pshat. You ready for this? Such a keeper. He says, "Vaya keshivto al kisei." He says, freeze frame the word kisei. 3 letters, kaf, samech, aleph. There are 3 laws that govern the king. Number one is the king is not allowed to have too much kaf, kesef, right? The pasuk says you're not allowed to have too much gold and silver. Number 2, the second rule governing the king, samach, sus, below yarbe susim. The king is not allowed to have too many horses. Aleph stands for the word Isha, below yarbe lo nashim. He's not allowed to have too many wives. So as long as he keeps kisei, the 3 rules governing kingship, he'll be able to sit on his throne for a long time. Great, brilliant, beautiful. Right? I don't think that's shot in the pasuk, but it's a very compelling commentary. I'll give you one more example. So the Torah in Parshas Bamidbar tells us about a census of the Jewish people. It's not the first census. The earlier census took place in Parshas Kisis. The Kli Yakar says, in Parshas Kisis, there was a census, and the only way to have a census was everyone had to give a machzus, a shekel. So whatever the reason for that is, if that's so important, why did we dispense with that reason when we get to Parshas Bamidbar? We're doing a census, and we're taking account of the Jewish people, and there's no machzus hashekel. So how do you explain that discrepancy? So the Kli Yakar says the following. He says at the first census, the shkalim were needed to protect the Jews from the ayin hara. If you do a direct count, right, there's this notion that if you count things, it could arouse the ire of the ayin hara. It makes people jealous. People are going to see the evil eye. So we're not going to count people. We're going to count the coins, and we'll avoid the ayin hara. Beautiful. So why isn't that necessary the second time around? So the says, no, the second time around, the Jewish people are already kind of established, and there's no ayin hara. You can count them directly. Then he says, let me give you a mashal. What's the difference between these two counts? Because you see a poor person holding a wad of cash. So that's ayin hara, because people don't expect to see that. And people see a pauper holding a wad of cash. People get all excited and they start talking, and it arouses jealousy. And okay, there's an ayin hara. We don't want that. The same situation, the millionaires holding a wad, that's normal. That doesn't arouse any interest or any ayin hara from any onlooker. So he says that's the mashal, that's the nimshal. The first census was taken right after the Jewish people had become a nation. They were poor and impoverished and former slaves, and the fact that they could be a people, right? That was at the risk of arousing ayin hara. By the time you get to Bamidbar, so you're all these years later in the wilderness, they're already established as a people. There's no ayin hara anymore. Okay? So again, take it or leave it, but fascinating that the Kli Yakar will always run to a remez, to a hint, to a parable, to help explicate the text. Okay, I would call it preaching for a purpose. His goal isn't just to make sense of the text. The text actually becomes a pretext. It's a jumping off point for moral instruction. And in particular, the Kli Yakar writes about this all the time. The Kli Yakar had a penchant for being a social critic and attacking specifically the practices of the wealthy. So again, this never would have happened in 11th century France if the Jewish people are fleeing from a crusade. No, this is happening at a time and in a place where you have court Jews, you have very successful landlords, you have wealth accumulating in the Jewish community, and along comes the Kli Yakar and says it's a trap. There are problems. People are getting alienated from Torah and mitzvos, and someone has to call them out on it. And the Kli Yakar becomes social critic, number one, to call people out on the abuses of wealth, the abuses of power, the problems and the pitfalls that are created by excess. Just by way of example of another area of interest of his. I have it for you in source number 5, and you could look at it more in depth. But I just mentioned it because it has so much contemporary resonance. He was also a great critic of the yeshiva system, and it's amazing. Like in 400 years, we're still talking about this. He says everyone rushes to learn Gemara, and he says it's such a problem. He says what happens? You get the kid to cheder, and they start reading the parsha, and so it's parshas Bereshis, and they get through 8 psukim in parshas Bereshis. Shkach. Then the next week it's parshas, so they start and they read 8 psukim in parshas Noach, and then you get to the next week, and it makes no sense. The jumping, they got nothing. There's no continuity of the narrative. There's no continuity of the story, and they don't know anything. He says you start learning Gemara, and they don't even know Mishnah. So it happens to be this is, again, part of a larger conversation. He was also in the mold of the Maharal. The Maharal was part of a Mishnah revolution in the 17th century. In particular, Mishnah became extremely popular, and there was an effervescence of Mishnah study. And the Kli Yakar was in the same school of thought. He said, learn Tanakh, learn Mishnah, wait until you learn Gemara. He says, everyone wants to marry off their kid, and they want to be able to say, my kid is so advanced, and he knows Gemara, and he knows Tosfos, and he goes to this yeshiva. That's not accomplishing anything, right? It's just gaivadik to try to show off about how much Gemara people know. That's not the goal. Go back to the basics, and he has a whole screed against the yeshiva system in 16th century Poland. I want to share one more fascinating source, and then I want to turn to the Kli Yakar on the parsha. This is in his introduction. You have it in source number 6 if you want to pull it up. In his introduction to, again, was probably his magnum opus, which is the Olalos Ephraim, a book of his sermons. in his introduction, he writes that there's like three groups that he has no patience for, and that are particularly upsetting to him, and that he has turned into his specific audience. This is part of the reason that he's writing this work, and this is part of the reason why he's so exercised. He says there are three groups that I want to identify as being particularly problematic. And this is about 10 lines down in source number 6, if you have the source. He says, Akasa achas heim ha'ashirim pnei haaretz. He says the first group, as I mentioned already, is the group of the wealthy. And he says that they're sitting around, they're just interested in achieving some kind of tranquility. They're totally intermingled and acculturated with non-Jews. And he says the idea of Jewish life and Jewish law and Jewish practice and the redemption is just so far from their consciousness, it's a terrible problem. Group number one. He says group number two are nothing to do with wealth, but he says people who have basically abandoned the yoke of the commandments. And he says this is a particular problem of Jews living in the diaspora. It's a problem in every generation, but he seizes upon it, and he says we have to do something to correct it. And he says group number 3 are the rabbis. He says the leadership. They all do their own thing. They never speak in a unified voice, and they are not effective in addressing the social and religious challenges of the moment. So I'm going to step in, and I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to be social critic number 1, and try to put people back on the path of the straight and narrow. A couple of last pieces I want to mention that are characteristics of Kliakar's commentary, and then I want to turn to the Parsha. Another important feature is that there's a kind of continuity between Torah Shebal Peh and Torah Shebichsav. And again, hopefully you'll see what I mean by this in a moment. But the notion that it's not like, oh, here's the text and we have various sources in Chazal that can inform. No, they all fit together. They all fit together, and I'll show you how. Two last pieces. One is halacha informs everything. Again, part of a much larger conversation, but there's a theme, at least one strain of thought that runs throughout Chazal, that the Torah has to be read from a halachic perspective. So if Abraham is serving his guests, and he's serving them milk and meat, because the pasuk says, right, that there was butter, cream, or whatever it was, and there was an ox. So we have to figure that out, because what would it mean? Right? So they're not bothered by the fact that Abraham lived before Matan Torah. No, how could it be that Abraham violated the Torah? Yaakov married 2 sisters. The Torah says you can't marry 2 sisters. So we have to explain, right, the justification for how Yaakov could marry 2 sisters. Right. So there are 100 issues that come up in this vein, and the Kli Yakar is very sensitive to them. He cares about them. He cares about them deeply, and I'll show you one example from the parsha. Final piece I want to say is the emphasis that the Kli Yakar placed on novelty, on novelty. So, and again, it comes back to the larger theme, and the larger argument that I want to make about his being a preacher. So you have to say a chiddush. There has to be something new, there has to be something novel, there has to be something creative, and it's not good enough to just kind of piece together what's already been said. I want to tell you something that hasn't been said. Again, sometimes it'll be compelling, sometimes it'll be less compelling, but very often it'll be novel. Okay? One of the most famous comments of the Kli Yakar, he writes a whole essay at the beginning of Parsha Shlach. He says, the big problem with the Meraglim, you ready for this? This is good for the 21st century. The big problem with the Meraglim? They were men. And if the Meraglim had been women, never would have happened. Okay? Just giving you a teaser. You can go read it. You imagine Rashi saying something like that? No, the Kli Yakar, right, in Blowaway, he's writing this again. He published this book in 1602. Had the Meraglin been women, never would have happened. Just because it touches on this notion of novelty, and it just sort of reifies the point I just made. Everyone asks in Parshas Bereshis, on the second day of creation, the Torah doesn't stop and say Vayar Elokim Ki Tov. Every other day, at least once, sometimes twice, the text stops and it says Hashem saw what was created. It was good. It was very good. Second day, it's missing. So how do you explain that? Why is there nothing good about the second day? So a lot of answers. The Kli Yakar's answer is the second day, nothing new, entirely new was created. And if there's nothing new that's created, it can't be described as Tov. Okay? Because the only thing that can be described as Tov is something that actually is fully new, is fully novel, right? And this is a theme that runs through the Kli Yakar. Okay. So let me just share with you, if you have your source sheet, I want to turn to our parsha and share with you a couple of the highlights that put a little meat on the bone and give you a sense of what the Kli Yakar is doing and how he explains some of the difficulties that all the Mefarshim encounter when they read Parshas Toldos. So one example in source number 7. Everyone wants to know, what does it mean that the Torah tells us, Vahi Esav ish yodei tzayid ish sadeh, veYaakov ish tam. So the Torah says, Yaakov and Esav were opposites. They were totally different. Esav was a man of the field. He was a trapper, a hunter. And Yaakov was Yoshev Ohalim. He stayed inside and he was a pure person. What is that about? Again, and you can imagine the text is so opaque. It could mean a lot of different things. So look at source number 7 for a second. The Kli Yakar says, let me tell you about Esav. It's not just that he was a hunter. What he trapped was much more problematic. He says, Vahi Esav ish yedei tzayid ish sadeh shahayat tzad nashim tachas ba'alehem kol 40 shana. The first 40 years of his life, you know what he trapped? He trapped married women. He ensnared them, and he was a philanderer. He was an adulterer, and this was his great crime. Uledas chazal ba'al nara murasa al kein kari yedei tzayid. There's a Gemara that said he slept with an engaged woman. So he says that's what it means. Yodea. So he knew how to entrap. He knew how to entice. Latsud nashim tachas ba'alehem ratzalamar yosheves tachas ba'alehem. Married women he was able to seduce. Aval olam halach l'tzudam besados k'moshenemar etzel na'marasa ki besade matza al kain karal esav ish sadeh. He says, and again he weaves together from another part of the Torah and creates one unified whole. He says, what does it mean that Esav was a man of the field? He says, let me tell you what else we find happens in the field. And if you go to Sefer Dvarim in Perek Chav Beis, you'll learn the halacha of the case of seduction and rape. And one of the specific cases of rape that the Torah mentions is someone who is raped out in the field. And that's an even worse crime, because if someone's raped out in the field and she cries for help, no one will hear her. He says, that's what it means that he was an Ish Sadeh, because that's what he used to do. He was such a Rasha, right, that it wasn't just bad enough that he had adulterous affairs, but he had them in a place where no one could ever discover them. Yaakov Ish Tam. What does that mean that Yaakov was tam? He was whole? I'll tell you what it means. Shenolad mahul ledas chazal. He finds a medrash that says that Yaakov was born already circumcised. And again, now it makes it almost the opposite of Yaakov, of Esav rather, right? That Esav can't control any of his desires, can't control his lust. Yaakov is already circumcised. There's already something there which prevents him from doing something any untoward. Al kain hayagadur me'arayos. He was already prevented, so to speak, from going down this path. Okay. Source number 8. Let me give you another comment of the Kli Yakar. Remember the story of the sale of the birthright. The story of the sale of the birthright. Yaakov comes back from the fields. He's very hungry. He's very tired. He sees this red stew that Yaakov is making, and he says, "I'll buy the birthright and I'll sell the birthright." And he says in the course of that conversation, "Hine anochi holech lamus." I'm going to die anyway. So what does it matter? And that is like just a bizarre, if not totally ridiculous thing to say. Everyone's going to die. That is irrelevant. The point is, presumably, one's parent dies before you, in which case there's some special status of the older sibling, and that's going to matter. I'm going to die, so who needs this? It's just bizarre on its face. So listen to the comment of the Kli Yakar. He says, "Hiskim l'divrei Yaakov ki niran hadvarim shebekavana v'lo b'mikrei yazed Yaakov nazid." He said, Esav started to piece things together. He said, why was Yaakov making this soup? Ki yada she'yavo Esav min hasadeh v'haya ritzono liknos mimenu habechora. Because Yaakov knew that Esav was going to come back from the field and he wanted to buy his birthright. Liton alav harei ata holech b'chol yom b'makom gedudei chayos v'chayecha tiluyin lecha mineged. He said, he basically said in so many words to Esav, I know that you lead a very dangerous life. And any day you go out to that field, you might not come back. So why is the birthright relevant to you? You're not going to live that long. He says, and for that reason, Yaakov says, I consider you already dead. You've taken your own life into your hands. And so Yaakov, the Kli Yakar says, made a soup that was specific to this occasion. The lentil soup is the soup that you give to the mourner. Al dash sheperish Rashi, misnachem lechal argecha kvar mishasa lecha koshel tanchumim. Right, this is what Rashi explicates. Kachasa Yaakov sudas havra al Esav. That when someone is in mourning, you want to give them something that will comfort them. And it happens to be that lentils are the food of the mourner. Lomar lo hareata domeh be'enai ki'ilu ata kvar meis v'lama ze lecha bechora. Rashi says, why was Yaakov making lentil soup? To feed his father, because Abraham, his grandfather, had just died. Yitzchak was an Avel, and so Yaakov was making the food of mourners. The Kli Yakar turns it on its head and says, yeah, Yaakov was making the food of mourners, but not because Abraham, his grandfather, had died, but because he was viewing Esav as already dead. He's saying, I'm preparing the Sudas Havra for your death. Right? What an extraordinary way to reinterpret this entire episode. And so Esav comes back to the field and he says, and now the clicker says, you can understand what Esav responded. He says, yeah, you're right. I do have a very dangerous profession. It is appropriate for you to make this stew because I'm basically dead already. Now you can understand why he said that. If I'm already closer to death than to life, why would I need the birthright? Once again, take it or leave it, but a fascinating, creative, and original way to understand this part of the Parsha. Totally novel, totally unexpected, and again, you'd never see this in Rashi or Ramban. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a source number 10. But I just showed it. I put it on the source sheet as an example of a case where he very specifically folds into his commentary a social critique of the moment. Right. So just to give you a quick snippet of what he's talking about. So there's a debate between Yitzchak and the Pelishtim about wells that his father had dug, and there's three different wells, and there's a whole midrashic tradition that the wells actually correspond to the three Batei Mikdash, the first two that are destroyed and the third one that will be that will be rebuilt. And in reviewing the course of Jewish history and talking about the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash, the Kli Yakar said the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of Schinas Chinam. Just like we have in our day, the third one will be built at a time of Shalom, but nobody understands Shalom in our day, right? And so built into the commentary as a running theme is this constant sense that he's taking a dig at his readership, right? They're going to read this and they say, oh, he's talking to me, right? Because yeah, I'm that guy who doesn't go to shul enough, and I'm that guy who isn't careful enough in his business relationships, and the Kli Yakar is talking directly to me. I'm sitting here trying to just read the Parsha, and he's screaming at me to be a better Jew, right? That's what the Kli Yakar does all the time. So let me just wrap up, because we're almost out of time, with one final excerpt from the Kli Yakar. You have this in sources number 11 and 12 toward the end of your source sheet. Okay, you remember the end of the Parsha. So Rivka has arranged this whole scheme where Yaakov has tricked his father Yitzchak into bestowing the blessing of the firstborn onto him, onto Yaakov, rather than onto Esau. Esau comes back from the field, and he's livid, right? He's been duped, he's been tricked, and he can't believe it. And he yells at Yaakov, and look at what he says. Source number 11. Vayomer hachi krashmo Yaakov. He says, I finally figured it out. That's why your name is Yaakov, you bum. V'yakveni ze pamayim, because you Yaakoved me twice. What does it mean? You Yaakoved me twice, meaning you tricked me twice, you duped me twice. Es bechorasi lakach, you stole my bechora, you stole my firstborn, my rights to the firstborn. V'nei ata lakach birchasi, and now you've taken my bracha. So the Kli Yakar asks a fascinating question. Source number 12. You took my bechora and you took my bracha. You Yaakoved me twice. The Kli Yakar says, Lama amar shelakacha bechora ba'akeva ve'remiyah. He says, why does Esav accuse Yaakov of swindling him twice? Ba'lo machra lo miratzon tov. He says, I don't understand. Yaakov's deal wherein he bought the birthright from Esav, so that wasn't a trick. That was a conversation between two adults who made a decision. Right? Pot of soup, birthright, you decide. Maybe Esav made a bad decision, but it wasn't a trick. Nobody put a gun to his head. He didn't have to make that deal. If he didn't think it was a good deal, he could have asked for a different deal, or he could have walked away and found another pot of soup. So you could tell me that the second incident is a trick. Granted, he dressed up like his brother and stole the birthright. There's no getting around that. But the first time around, why is that a trick? Second line, he says, "V'akarav elai lemor bazeh shamar Esav haba hatalia kikishalu Yitzchak mi atzav heshiv lo anochi Esav b'charecha v'eichotzi davar sheker mipiv alo shir Yisrael lo yidavar kazav." He says it was all a setup. Yaakov knew this from the beginning. He says, why? And this answers like a very important question, which is, if Yaakov was going to do this whole thing anyway, right? Why did he need to steal the birth? What did he ever get out of stealing? What did he ever get out of duping Esav out of the birthright? Right? What did it matter? So the Kli Yakar is so bothered by this question. He says, no. This is the idea, and this is what I was alluding to before when I said it's all a continuum, right? And all of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh fit together. So, and this comes back to the conversation we had about what it means for our avos and imahos to make mistakes and whether or not we understand them as mistakes or they're justified. So the Kli Yakar says it's totally justified, meaning the incident that we read about at the end of the Parsha where Yaakov says, yeah, I'm your Bechor, it can't be that Yaakov would have uttered a bold-faced lie. He led his father to a conclusion that wasn't exact. Okay, so maybe that could be, but for Yaakov to utter words that are sheker, it can't be. So Esav now pieces it all together. And he says, that's why Yaakov got me to sell the birthright, because he was planning all along to say these words, I'm the Bechor. And he could only say those words if they were true. And they're true in as much as Yaakov had purchased the birthright from his brother, in which case, yeah, technically speaking, that first incident wasn't a swindle, but now Esav's the bright guy, and he figures out that everything was in fact part of one grand scheme, and his brother has in fact swindled him twice. In the 3 minutes I have left, I'll share with you one last comment of the Kliyakar to drive home one last point. The point I mentioned earlier, that the halachic system informs the entire Torah. Very end of the parsha, toward the end of the parsha, the Torah tells us, source number 13, Vayistom Esav es Yaakov. Esav hated Yaakov guts, ala bracha asher becho aviv, about the bracha that his father had blessed him. Vayamar Esav v'libo, he says, Yikrevu yemei evel avi, v'harga es Yaakov achi. He says, the day of mourning will come for my father, and at that point I'll kill my brother. And the Kliyakar says, what is he talking about? The days of mourning for my father. It's such an odd formulation. When my father dies and he's not around, I'll kill my brother. When the days of my father's mourning, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? So here the Kliyakar introduces a halachic observation that never would have occurred to us on a pshat level. He says, Yikrevu yemei evel avi. Source number 14, Tala davar b'mei evel lefi sha'avel asur lasuk b'Torah. Ki pekudei Hashem yishar mesamchilei. Let me tell you what's special about Avelus. He says, an Avel is not permitted to learn Torah because learning Torah brings joy to a person, and an Avel should be mourning and shouldn't be celebrating. V'yitzchak amar v'yaka asher tarid dehainu bisman shelo yasuk b'Torah uparakas olah. V'im kein ba'avelo vaday lo yasuk b'Torah v'lo yadavar hamigin alav az aharga es achi. He says, when my father dies, Yaakov is going to be prevented from learning Torah because he's going to be an Avel. And without the protection afforded to a person that comes from learning Torah, he'll be defenseless, and I'll be able to kill him. Okay. So the Kliyakar turned Esav into a Talmudic, genius, into a Talmud Chacham. So he's reasoning, right, about when his brother is going to be defenseless based on the fact that when Yaakov is sitting Shiva for Yitzchak, Yaakov won't be in a place to be protected by Torah because an Avel is not allowed to learn Torah. This is the preacher par excellence, the Maggid par excellence, and he'll use every trick in the book. I didn't mention it, but you have it in source number 12. He says the bracha, the bechora. He says it's a siman because if you just rearrange the letter, berach and bracha, they're the same, right? The bechor and the bracha, it's the same letter, so it's all part of one. It's all part of one scheme. Whatever trick in the book, a parable, a remez, a gematria, a story, halacha, whatever the Kliyakar can find to bring text to life and to bring the moral relevance of the text to life, he will absolutely use it. For 400 years, right? His book has been a bestseller. If you're looking for a word on the parsha, there's nothing like a Kliyakar. He hits it out of the park all the time. Just be prepared, right, to move through all sectors of the entire canon of Jewish life. It's not just pshat, and it's not just drash, and it's not just Kabbalah, but it's everything, because that is the job of the inspirational speaker. That's the job of the Maggid par excellence, the Kliyakar of Ephraim of luncheons. Please God, we'll pick up next time. I'm sensitive to the time. It's 9:00, so I want to stop. But I will be happy to stay on and take any questions or comments. And I wish everyone a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.